I was wrong about Unfathomable. I fell for the meme and became the fool, a buffoon of my own making. Like those dudes in Plato's cave, I stared at what I thought was real and was convinced that Unfathomable was a hollowed out version of the all-time classic board game, Battlestar Galactica. Unfathomable was the rebranded knockoff, like off-brand cereals and Temu Electronics, to the glorious original. And this sentiment was everywhere, and all discourse really just came down to, it's just a worst Battlestar, so why even bother? But a very recent expansion from the Abyss came out, and I thought it might be a neat idea to try it all together, and see if this ship was salvageable. At its core, Unfathomable is a game about trusting people to do the right thing. So what's the game? In Unfathomable, 3 to 6 players will set sail to Boston on the SS Atlantica, and throughout the 3-ish hour journey, you'll be able to help or hinder the cruise. You'll start the game off by picking a unique character, grab an item, have your ultimate feat ability, go to your starting room, and really just hope for the best. Now, the twist of this cruise ship is that instead of being infested by boomers and norovirus, you've got to deal with fish people. These little buddies are the Deep Ones, and their father Dagon and mother Hydra all invade and attack the ship. But they have also infiltrated humanity with secret hybrid players. Yes, that's right, there are traitors on board, and just like a top 10 anime betrayal list, the game encourages you to lie to your nakama. Each player will be handed a loyalty card, either human or fish hybrid, and that determines your goal for the game. Your loyalty isn't inherently set in stone, because at the halfway point of the game you'll receive an additional loyalty card that could flip you from human to hybrid. For example, in a 5-player game, there would be a deck of 10 loyalty cards. 8 of them would be humans and 2 would be fishman hybrids, who would want to sink the ship. What this means is that at the very start of the game, there is a 22% chance to have 0 hybrids, 55% to have 1 hybrid, and 22% to have both hybrids in play at the very start. In other words, some games you'll play half the game and there won't even be an evil team. And other games you'll find 2/5 of the players are already sabotaging from the very beginning. This first draw results in an incredibly different experience and different strategies that end up being employed by everyone involved. And the reason why I love this is that even if no one is a hybrid, there is still a ton of accusations that get thrown about. And on the flip side, there's always a way for a hybrid player to hide this doubt of whether they exist or not. Like a raw chicken nugget, the illusion of tastiness can often be covered by a batter of deceit. Then at about the halfway point to our journey to Boston, there is more certainty of what the exact competition of loyalties are. There's still always a tinge of uncertainty though, because what if someone got the hybrid card twice? It adds a few layers into the reveal itself, because whatever that mystery card someone else just received just adds to the drama of it all. Now, some people may say, well, what about 4 players or 6-player games? I heard Battlestar is only playable at 5 players. And thankfully, Unfathomable has implemented a massive improvement over Battlestar with the addition of the Cultist. The Cultist is kind of a third faction in a way. They're human who desperately wants to become a fish person, but this transformation takes time. So the Cultist does their absolute best to keep the ship afloat until the very end stage where they finally sprout their gills and become a hybrid player. The reason why this works so well is that it really helps with the balance to make human players get to that final stretch, but then that final stretch is even harder since the Cultist has now flipped into a fishman hybrid. It creates an increasing flow of tension because the other hybrid players know their best bet is to wait and sink at the very end, and humans know that that final stretch is going to be a very tough struggle. Unfathomable breeds in murky suspicion between players. Even a player who is an evil fish hybrid isn't too sure if they're alone or have secret supporters at the start of the game. It is truly a traitor game that makes all the hybrids feel isolated, since they're all hiding from each other and other players. And this sense of suspense escalates as more problems occur. Just like any terrible workplace, someone needs to be blamed for all the problems aboard. And this all culminates in a grand betrayal. Like how Judas betrayed Christ for 30 pieces of silver, the hybrids will reveal themselves for the sweet, sweet embrace of Mother Hydra. These reveals are often hilarious and some of the most memorable moments of all board games. After 3 hours of a long journey to Boston, having the captain reveal himself as a hybrid and the crew just loses some more sanity is just fun, memorable, and cuts deep into the psyche from all those times we trusted him. The constant fear and suspicion of one another is so tangible, and it's so deliciously clever. And look, I won't lie, Unfathomable is a long and sometimes complex game. Running at between 2 to 4 hours at any player count, and with dozens of interlocking mechanics, character abilities, loyalties, and a ton of decks. Unique skill decks, an item deck, a spell deck, a waypoint deck, a damage deck, a chaos deck, and the one and only big, chunky Mythos deck. It's a lot of decks, and I didn't even mention the deck board spaces. All of this can be overwhelming to any player, but I find that as long as one player is familiar with the game, even casual gamers can wrap their head around the game. In the same way that Blood on the Clock Tower has a disproportionate knowledge requirement for the storyteller, Unfathomable needs one player to manage the enemies, manage the movement of the ship, to make players aware of potential actions or triggers, and to keep track of all the tracks. You need a person to be the glue, otherwise everything will fall apart into disarray and mismatched decks of confusion. That said, the game loop is fairly simple. All a human player needs to do is draw skill cards, do 2 actions, draw the bad news Mythos card, and then discard to 10 cards. That's really only 4 main steps of each turn, and 2 of those steps only take a few seconds. The hard part is deciding what actions to take, and the long part is going over the Mythos card and solving that crisis. When it comes to actions, this is usually involving the ship itself. You might speed up the ship by using the boiler room, or use the chapel and get on your knees to pray the monsters away, or move and fight some deep ones, rescue passengers, or use one of your action cards, or a unique character ability. There's a ton of variety, but the actual actions are very fast and easy to complete, often just requiring a dice roll. The fact that there are a ton of potential actions, but you're limited to only 2 actions per turn, creates an interesting puzzle for both the human and hybrid players. Maximizing action economy like you're playing brass is the meat of the individual strategy. On the flip side, the Mythos cards can often be the longest part of anyone's turn. Mythos cards are the problems that you encounter on the ship at the end of every single turn. These cards might be helping lost kittens, first-class passengers, or a call from an unimaginable horror who wants to destroy your fragile psyche. Sometimes a player will need to make a choice, and other times you'll need to contribute cards from your hand to do something called a skill check. A skill check is kinda like having everyone put in ingredients into a recipe. But since you're putting these ingredients in blindly, someone could sabotage this recipe. For example, if they were told to put in salt, but they put in sugar, there could be potential to ruin the eventual cook. This leads to many opportunities of terrible sabotage from hybrids and cultists by poisoning the success of the human players through subtle manipulation of these checks and key decisions. Of course, after the Mythos card is resolved, enemies move as well. Whether that's going deeper into the ship or attacking from the exterior, there's a lot of problems that arise after each and every turn. And even for hybrids and cultists, they'll be following the same routine as humans, but instead they try to keep stumbling over themselves as much as possible. Failing dice rolls, making bad decisions, and really just playing as suboptimally as they possibly can without making it obvious. It's hilarious because sometimes you'll suspect someone of being a fish person because they're playing poorly, but they just angered the RNG gods and can't help but draw the worst possible Mythos cards or fail the most critical dice roll without any ill intent. Even when a hybrid or cultist reveal themselves as a fish, the general gameplay remains the same, except now you get access to a new treachery deck and you can't use the ship's spaces freely. But you can attack other humans and get yourself attacked. It adds a new dynamic to the game, but does feel weaker than being secretly hidden. That said, revealing as a hybrid does enable a one-time character-specific power to really mess up whatever good thing is going on. It can often be used as an opportunistic attack to sink the ship in one fell swoop. In other words, you can go all out and release your Ultra Instinct in one-time traitor abilities, but after you've done your master stroke, you're an easy target for human players to take down. It's all very approachable and makes sense in the context of the game. Even with people who are new to board games, the concept of defeating fish enemies, rescuing passengers, and going to rooms to activate them is a very tangible and engaging experience. You just need that one person to manage the admin of enemy movements and attacks, as well as to keep track of all the dials and movements. My favorite example of the ingenuity of this game is when enemies are in the water space and the ship moves forward. All the enemies get pushed back one space, representing that the ship is physically moving past these sea monsters. People's eyes light up and it's obvious that they understand how the movement of the ship connects to the placement of enemies without needing to explain enemy movements from the nuts and bolts perspective. Each individual mechanic is approachable, and Unfathomable layers them in a way to create a very logical and flavorful sandwich of themes and decisions. Okay, so that's the quick and dirty summary of what to expect from the base game. So why then did I think I was so wrong about this game? Well, everything in the base game was good. It was fine. But the Battlestar Galactica people had a point. It's a retheme of a game that already existed. But I loved my time with Battlestar, and I wanted to capture the same feelings of betrayal and triumph without spending 500 plus for the game and all its expansions. So while the base game of Unfathomable feels like a best of collection for Battlestar Galactica, From the Abyss takes Unfathomable into its own thing and brings new ideas into the mix. And while the base game is definitely a complete game, but I really think the expansion rounds the sometimes rough edges and makes the game feel truly full. In other words, the expansion doesn't really aim to change the fundamentals, but wants to add a glistening sheen and polish that changes a passable experience into a fantastic one. So starting off, From the Abyss provides a bunch of start of game modifiers in the form of preludes. Some good ones, bad ones, neutral ones, and each type has 5 different cards. What you do is draw one of each type and modify the initial state of the game. And I'm a total fan of these, and I use all 3 for each game. In the base game, the initial board state is the same each time, so having these slight modifications to add new problems and new solutions to the very start keeps the game fresh. Some players also use these preludes to adjust the balance. If the hybrid team has been crushing it, you would only draw the day card, for example. Truthfully, I wish there were more of these added, because while 5 of each is fine, I am seeing repeats and I would have liked 10 to 15 of each, just to keep things surprising in each game. Still, good stuff overall. 8 new characters. Of course, what's an expansion without new characters? And From the Abyss almost doubles the base 10 to 18. Each character is very flavorful, unique, and most importantly, fun. Most people just play off vibes, so it's important that they added the I See Dead People kid, hardworking fisherwoman, and the fez-wearing Turkish detective. I feel like the roster of 18 is really enough to work with any group, and while 10 characters was sufficient, 18 feels full and polished. Furthermore, the strategy of each character really does meld with their character's lore and items. For example, Avery the boatswain is just a really outwardly likable and popular dude. So his ability is that you can use allies on the boat without paying a cost. And he also has the one-time ability to spawn more allies and also take over as the captain or keeper of the tome from all the popular support he has. Guillemene is also centered around that same mechanic of allies, but instead of gaining their support through popularity, he's a spiritualist who can speak to them in death. So instead of interacting with them on the ship, Guillemene collects their souls and uses their abilities after they are dead. And a lot of characters share the same design philosophy. Some enable other players, reduce RNG, or cheat out extra actions. But each character takes a substantially different way in approaching a mechanic that really dramatically changes the overarching strategy. Which of course also changes depending if you are a hybrid or human player as well, which just further adds layers into this feast of decisions. I very much appreciate the design of the characters from a gameplay perspective. They each feel unique, but since they aren't limited to potential roles like in BSG, team composition is less important for the success of the ship. You don't necessarily need a well-rounded team to have a great game, which often felt like a requirement in BSG. And the unique abilities, starting items, and feats are varying levels of complexity and wackiness. Again, it's all good stuff. Allies. Now, speaking of allies, allies are another new mechanic that represent other crew members or passengers on the ship with active abilities. They spawn when you save a group of passengers, and in order to use them, you need to be in their space and discard a certain amount of skill card value. Now, I should mention that allies do exist in Battlestar as well, and while the idea is the same, their functionality is very different. Overall, the allies in Unfathomable let you cheat out powerful extra abilities every turn for a cost. If you need to fix a space but don't want to move that space, well, you got the mechanic. If you want to stack the Mythos deck, there's a fortune teller. If you want to rescue a passenger, you got the able seaman. I find that using allies as a human player is almost always worth it if they are already in a convenient space with that player. Not to mention, they're just a fun idea. You get to do more actions per turn, and they scurry away afterwards, and if they happen to get caught in the ritual spell, they just all die from either getting deleted or get put on the spiritualist board as a soul. It's fun, thematic, and adds a layer of emergent storytelling that keeps the flavor going. Boons. Another addition is always the positive boon cards, which are the yin to the yang of the treachery cards. Boon cards have powerful abilities, as well as are always positive for skill checks, but they are rare to be drawn. With the boon cards, the Chaos deck is now modified to have 7 possible skill cards. Boons really round out the skill decks into something that feels fairer and just more interesting. Even though not the flashiest addition, I find all this under the hood improvements as very meaningful because the game is now a bit more wild and there's more possibility for human players to fight back at what sometimes feels like insurmountable odds. Horrors. If you just take a look on the box, the biggest selling point of this expansion are the 3 additional enemy types, the horrors. These 3 types spawn a little differently than the matriarchs and the deep ones and use an activation track to spawn one of them. You got the tentacles, the drowned spirit dude, and the Shoggoth, and each one of these is a little different. For example, the grasping tendril, these tentacles will go into the water and pull passengers from the ship into water to eventually drown them and die. The Shoggoth spawns on the outer deck of the ship and will defeat players, destroy interiors, and eat items from the item deck. And the drowned spirit spawns directly inside of the interior of the ship and starts damaging the insides while destroying cards found in the tome. All 3 of these horrors are a middle ground between the easily defeated deep ones and the untouchable matriarchs. While these 3 types can be defeated in combat, they don't die, they just move further away. And in a way, they are quite sticky and a persistent threat on the board. That said, as a human player, I don't find them too overbearing as they are a bit slow to spawn and their effects aren't necessarily worse than a bad set of deep ones rampaging throughout the ship. When playing, the horrors add a nice element of anxiety because they can be a little tricky to destroy through the spell track or having the ship move beyond their reach. They provide another opening for a hybrid or cultist to create chaos. Also, now with 6 different enemy types, the overall variety of each game is dramatically improved, and each game feels fresh and challenging in a different way. The horrors are a massive success in my opinion, as they increase enemy variety without ever feeling unfair or skewed in the favor of the hybrid players. Partly because human players have added tools with the allies, but also partly because these horrors do feel a bit like a slow threat relative to the blitz of the deep ones or the unstoppable attacks from Mother Hydra. It's just good game design. Another new threat that moves slow but is hard to remove, just fills in the blanks that have been previously missing, and rounds out the enemies in a meaningful way. Additional items, spells, waypoint, and skill cards. Of course, what's an expansion without filling out every deck with more stuff? From the Abyss adds more of everything, from unique and powerful items to some of the best spells in the game, as well as 2 new skill cards for each deck, with new mechanics such as these 0 value skill cards that enable an effect after the skill check is done, or these ultra powerful 6 value ones. Every deck is bigger, better, and the variety is just significantly improved. I can't think of a single complaint or negative to any of these additions. Likewise, minor rule amendments like saving all passengers in 1 deck space and 1 action, or drawing 3 spells instead of 2, all improve the game in subtle ways that I appreciate. The Mythos deck. Of all of the additions, the one I appreciate the most is the addition of the Mythos deck cards. You know, all the stuff I mentioned previously represents about half of the game, because the other half is in all of this, the Mythos deck. This deck is so core to the flow of the game, so having a good deck is necessary for Unfathomable being a good game. And thankfully, From the Abyss almost doubles the size of this deck with fun and interesting cards. These decisions can be very tough sometimes, and the skill checks feel fair and powerful when passed, but brutal when failed. It's a wonderful deck of problems to solve, and I very much appreciate the extra heft to it all. It's a meaty pack of cards, from the wacky, inconsequential squabbles of the first-class passengers, to the calls of the deep, to the personal dramas that need to be dealt with. This Mythos deck feels well crafted and sets the pace of the entire game. And just look how thick this deck is. There's so much variety and just so much that keeps happening. Each game still feels fresh. Having this thick and refined deck is very, very welcome, considering it's almost half of the game. Look, when you put all of Unfathomable and From the Abyss together, there is a feeling of responsibility to one another. Because the game can be so unforgiving at times, human players really do need to trust one another to do the right thing, to push the right button and to have trust in one another. This part of the game is genius because as a hybrid, it is very easy to be willing to help human players outwardly, but to sabotage from the shadows. And what I mean by this is the game encourages outward support and friendliness against what seems to be impossible odds. How many times will a Shoggoth attack us? How many deep ones are on board now? We only have 2 fuel and 3 sanity left. It's a constant set of problems and constant stress. So human players will need to turn to anyone to help them, and a smart hybrid player will help outwardly while secretly ruining the skill checks or pretending not to have any buffs, or just by picking the most suboptimal path forward. Unfathomable is completely unlike other social deduction games or survival games, because brilliantly the game isn't always guaranteed to have someone who's on the evil team at the start. Like I mentioned before, in a 5-player game, about 22% of all games won't even start with someone evil, but there's always some suspicion. The game adds just enough room for error that even if everyone is human, you can still accuse of someone of being a fish person. Yes, by the end of the game, there will always be at least one guaranteed hybrid player, but even then, the previous accusations carry from the early stages of the game, which provide further room for bluffing for the true hybrid player. And this leads me to a very common complaint, which is the brig. This prison space locks up players, and a lot of criticism is levied that if you go into the brig, all the fun is sucked dry from your turns. And I really don't see it that way. Going to the brig isn't like a death sentence like dying in Nemesis or Mafia. I especially found that because the game is so oppressive at what is going to be attacking human players, putting another human player in the brig is often enough to guarantee a loss. Players are smart enough to know this, and using the brig is often just a last resort, or used against a player who is obviously a hybrid, but hasn't revealed themselves from the game's perspective. These soft revealed players actively demonstrate that they have no interest in helping humans, but don't want to reveal as a hybrid yet. And at least in my group's meta, the brig is reserved for these players. And then they reveal and they get out by discarding skill cards. And in fact, I find the brig a very, very mild form of player elimination that has more than enough counterplay to be a healthy addition to the game. Another common complaint is that games are too long and too complicated and have too much admin busy work. First, on the game length, Unfathomable runs between 2.5 to 4 hours depending on how fast people play. Player count doesn't really matter either because the end game objective of either sinking the ship or reaching Boston requires the same total resource depletion, damage, or distance traveled, which isn't shortened by having fewer players. You can expect to play around 30 turns per game. So with 4 players, that's about 8 turns each, and with 6 players, that's about 5 turns per player. In other words, the total amount of turns doesn't change, but individual impact is reduced because you'll have fewer turns per player. It's not really to say that 1 player count is best though. 5 feels the most standard, but the cultist is a very healthy addition to the game, and having 4 players would create a stronger sense of individual player agency. The truth of it is that the actual time you're moving your characters around and acting is fairly minimal. There are not a lot of actions available for a 3-hour game, which can make people feel like they lack agency. I think this is a fair point, but I don't think it's much of a critique. And the reason for this is the actions are not the entire game. A ton of the game is in the Mythos deck, and resolving these Mythos cards, discussing the options, joining in for the skill check, revealing the value of the cards themselves, this is all also part of the collective game everyone is playing. Just because you aren't reading the Mythos card doesn't mean it doesn't matter to you, or that you can't interact with it. And you're going to resolve a lot of these cards. What's on the board and the actions you take on the board itself isn't the full game. The game is also a little storybook of little problems and little choose your own adventure style consequences that is all communally discussed and weighed and analyzed. Not to mention the whole social deduction aspect of the game that follows after each and every turn. And that's why I was so glad to see that the Mythos deck got a hefty upgrade in the expansion. Because seeing a never seen before Mythos card is fun and is a large part of what keeps this game together. Even though you have fairly limited actions, and yes, it can take some time to come back to you, doesn't mean that you don't have direct input in the trajectory of the game as a whole. And like a social deduction game, a lot of the fun is played between players and between reading the lines of each other's decisions. Multiplayer solitaire fans just won't get it. And on the admin, the enemy management is super easy and follows a very simple logic. It should only take 30 seconds to resolve a large swath of attacks and damage to the ship. Same with spawning them and moving them. You just really need one person to read the rules ahead of time and understand how everything interacts, and I really just don't see this as an issue. It's impossible not to recognize the big old Battlestar that looms over the SS Atlantica. People love BSG. The characters and the theme are blended into the game that only a few other games can rival. And I know this is a little sacrilegious to say, I don't really play BSG after I've played Unfathomable with its expansion. Unfathomable and From the Abyss take everything that worked well in BSG and refined it into a more thoughtful, smooth, and just funner experience. Components like the Cylon fleet board are revamped in a new and much more improved boarding of deep ones and horrors. The miracle cards of Daybreak are so much worse than the feat cards that each character gets in Unfathomable. The addition of the cultist over the human or Cylon sympathizer role and the Cylon leader role is just so much better and easier to play with. It actually makes the 4 and 6 player games rival those of 5 players. The removal of junk mechanics like risking raptors or having to be a pilot to fight Cylon ships are all gone and beneficial to the flow of the game. Even the character abilities, both normal and traitor abilities, are more useful and create a better balance than the often thematic but poorly implemented character abilities in BSG. Everything in Unfathomable just works without the admittedly charming clunkiness of BSG. There is no doubt that Battlestar forged itself into a classic. And yes, Battlestar and its 3 expansions still has more content and modules than Unfathomable and From the Abyss. But a lot of that content and alternative game modules are bloat that dilute what makes this type of game fun. The emergent storytelling is better thanks to the streamlining and improvements to the gameplay in Unfathomable. The truth is, Unfathomable and From the Abyss is a beefy, full game, but keeps everything in working order because of smart decisions and adaptations from its progenitor. The mechanics all work together, make sense, and there is more than enough variety with its large cast, new enemies, and various gameplay improvements. It sails its own path and succeeds in improving a classic game in tangible ways. Yes, it lacks a recognizable theme, but I find that a lot of people are polarized over the BSG theme to begin with. Fans of the show love it, and people who don't watch it are mostly indifferent or even slightly apprehensive. Unfathomable is a very approachable, well-executed, but generic theme that is enticing enough for almost anyone. But look, just hold on for 1 minute. Most games have a generic theme: fantasy, historical, sci-fi, nature, and even, yes, Lovecraftian. It's nearly impossible for a board game to compete with a well-established franchise to create an IP that's as strong as 4 seasons of a TV show. It just isn't fair to say, well, I just couldn't relate to William Bowleg in the same that I could with President Rosslyn. When you've seen like 75 episodes of TV compared to a short 4-paragraph backstory. And the counterpoint is that you've already created a personality based off the IP. Therefore, in a way, the generic theme in Unfathomable creates room for roleplay that wouldn't be possible with those who are familiar with characters in BSG. Anyways, a lot of people say it's a one-to-one adaptation with a slapped-on Cthulhu theme. And that just isn't the case. Fathomable is more akin to a successor than it is to a clone. Yes, it doesn't have a licensed recognizable theme to lean on, but the characters, the setting, the gameplay all meld together into creating something that's worth getting a bunch of people together for an evening of mishaps and suspense. There's another common complaint, and that is the game is fundamentally unbalanced. The truth is, yeah, the game is kind of all over the place. I think the biggest problem people have is that after a few games, you'll realize that the hybrid players tend to win more often than not. I'd say it's about a 70-30 win-loss for hybrids, which can really break the mind of those sweats out there who really like to optimize and treat each game as a competitive endeavor. And what really annoys me is that whenever I read discourse online about this balance, it's all over the place. Some people complain about how an early reveal traitor is too powerful with their new treachery cards. Other people complain that the soft reveal hybrid in the galley is too powerful. Other people think that the game itself is too hard and the traitor can just remain hidden and crush all hopes over 1 or 2 key skill checks. It really reminds me of when a brand new game comes out and there's threads about how X character is broken or Y character is useless or the most OP strat. But when you compile all these conversations, everything is broken and everything is underpowered simultaneously. It's been a conversation since BSG first came out, and I recommend just to zone out the noise and enjoy your own game with your own group's meta. And the thing is, I know why this is a problem. Unfathomable invites a paradox. It's a 3-ish hour long game with dozens of interlocking mechanics. It has a ton of depth and variance, but if it's played like a hyper-competitive game, you're going to have a bad time. So it invites people who really like complex and long and detailed high-conflict games, but at the same time, it isn't viable as a competitive game. And to me, this really isn't a problem. It's just best played as a vehicle to have fun and have an emergent story, not competition. If you go in with that mindset, the win-loss ratio of what team wins doesn't really matter. And secondly, I don't think this game is balanced around each team, but instead balanced around the goal to have a very close squeaker of a game. The game is designed to make those final few turns matter, and to always feel like you're at the very edge of success. And it is a success because the game consistently reaches that very final round where making it home to Boston is so close, but you only have 1 or 2 of a key resource left. This balance, this tension, is far more important than the actual win-loss ratios, because the story has a climax and the tension rises to a peak. The game works amazingly for the goal it has, and I find this far more important than the actual balance. And the trick of this is that this build-up, this climax, it all feels well-deserved and is unique every game. It's not an exercise in predestination like Candyland or Secret Hitler. Unfathomable and From the Abyss is both deep and vast. When you make it to those final rounds, you've actually done the work. You've made the decisions, and the journey feels unique. It is rewarding whether you win or lose because the story you and your buddies went on is memorable, and the strategies either paid off or crippled the ship beyond repair. It's a joy to experience, and Unfathomable recognizes that providing the decision space and depth and strategy to create these unique experiences is what really matters. If you go into Unfathomable and From the Abyss with the intent to min-max as a soft revealed hybrid, and start counting skill cards like a deranged poker player, looking to steal any chance of victory against people who've played maybe once or twice before, yeah, you're probably gonna win. The competitive aspect of the game at least. But if the point of the game is to have a fun, emergent story, did you really win anything? Unfathomable is not that kind of competitive, sweaty game. To play it as a vehicle for your competitiveness needs every other person on board to share the same mentality. And at that point, you'll be overcome by the frustrations of RNG and the intended innate imbalance of the game. And it wouldn't even work as a competitive game. So why bother gavaging a meta when you could just enjoy the ride as a more emergent story with high conflict and high interaction. It's just wrong. Of course, there's a lot of strategy, planning, and playstyle expression, and you should always try to win. But trying to argue that the game isn't perfectly balanced between characters or loyalties is a moot point in my opinion. You definitely have player agency, and a ton of it, but the game can really change on a dime at any given moment. Heck, in about a quarter of your 5-player games, you won't even start with a hybrid player on the board. And these games are much easier to win than the ones where you start with 2 hybrids on board. But that's why it's fun, it's suspense, and it's story, and it's supposed to make your buddies laugh. Of course the balance is out of whack. And if you're on a loss streak, there's house rules or even recommended prelude cards to adjust the game balance. But I believe it wasn't the goal to make a perfectly balanced game. It was a goal to create a lengthy, fun, deep, tense game of suspicions and betrayals, which Unfathomable ultimately succeeds in. There is nothing wrong with a juicy, meaty game that isn't designed as a competitive game. And in this way, I applaud the design. I get it, I felt the same way too. How could a game that just slaps on a generic Cthulhu IP overtake one of the titans of all of board gaming? But Unfathomable has won me over. The rebalancing of the game, the new mechanics, the streamlining of core concepts have all pushed the game from what might have seemed like a knockoff into its own thing worthy of existing and worthy of time and money. Then you add on From the Abyss, with the very helpful allies, the new characters, the new enemy types, and the giant stack of Mythos cards, and the game is pushed into a new, better direction than anything that Battlestar did. It feels shockingly fresh, and the gameplay is just smoother than ever. And nostalgia is a hell of a drug, and when we look back at all those old memories and hilarious reveals or being tossed in the brig as a Cylon, we can still look at those moments and recognize that Battlestar can still be a bit of a messy game. Unfathomable is approachable, teachable, and an improved version for a generation of players who have probably never even seen a single episode of Battlestar Galactica. Truthfully, a lot of people who played really felt like the Cthulhu theme was cohesive and engaging throughout the 3-hour playtime. And when I mentioned it was based off an older BSG game, there was a visible confusion on what Battlestar Galactica was and how it relates to fish people. BSG is not as notable as a franchise as it was in 2009, so playing a game based on it isn't inherently a positive for all people. That said, there is definitely a saturation of Cthulhu on the market, but there is obvious care in the models, the character, the boat itself. Everything is made with the theme in mind. It just might not be your preferred theme. Because of this, I have to concede. Unfathomable with From the Abyss is my favorite hidden traitor game. Games like Nemesis or Dead of Winter would be in the same family of games, but Unfathomable smartly avoids the pitfalls of these games and has a stronger core gameplay loop than the great ancestor of the genre, BSG. I have to give Unfathomable with From the Abyss a solid 9 out of 10. It's just a very good time, and if you go in with the right mindset and aren't tripped up by nostalgia, I think you'll find an excellent journey to share laughs and make memorable moments with friends. Thank you for watching.